propose updates to the program this year. And this workshop today is a continuation of a series of workshops that have been held over the past several months to discuss initial concepts for those potential updates. So in past workshops, we've discussed removal of allowances from budgets. So we know we're looking at a future with more stringent allowance budgets for the program. Today, the topic is focused on allowance allocation and emissions coverage. So in the context of that future, more stringent program, we're having this conversation about how the allowances are distributed to the market and what might be appropriate there. We have some staff presentations to start off. It'll be 45 minutes to an hour or so. We've got three program staff who will be presenting: Michael Turgeon and Camille Sultana from the Cap and Trade program, and then Smadar Levy from the Mandatory Reporting Regulation program will be giving some initial concepts and updates related to the Mandatory Reporting Regulation that are associated with the changes to the Cap and Trade program. We do have several staff on this call to support responses to questions during the Q&A session that we'll hold after the presentation. We have Greg Mayer, Ryan Showland, and Sid Partridge from the Mandatory Reporting Regulation. We also have Rachel Gold from the Cap and Trade program, and Rajinder Sahota and Matt Botil from the Industrial Strategies Division, overseeing all the programs. So with that brief introduction, I will hand it over to Michael Turgeon to initiate the staff presentations.
Thank you, Mark. A few more workshop logistics before we get started. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted on the Cap and Trade Meetings and Workshops page, where you can find material for today's workshop and a link to CARB's public comment docket. The deadline to submit written feedback is June 14th. Okay, today staff will present a brief overview of the potential changes to the Cap and Trade program, focusing on budgets and overall allowance distribution. We will follow with discussions on utility allocation, industrial allocation, and emissions coverage and specific emissions exemptions. Mandatory Reporting Regulation, or MRR, staff will then briefly present initial concepts on updating MRR reporting periods before the public comment period. We'll now provide a brief overview of the potential changes to the Cap and Trade program. At the highest level, California's climate policies, like Cap and Trade, are determined by state legislation and executive orders. These statutes and directives establish both statewide GHG targets or sector-specific goals, which inform CARB's climate change scoping plan and individual policies and regulations. Since the adoption of the first scoping plan in 2008, carbon pricing in the form of a Cap and Trade program has been part of California's successful portfolio approach to achieving the state's GHG emissions reduction targets, and it will remain critical as we work toward economy-wide decarbonization. The process to update the program is being informed by AB 1279, which established the state goals of reducing anthropogenic GHG emissions by 85% below 1990 levels and achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. The 2022 scoping plan update, which indicated the need to increase 2030 emissions reductions from the SB 32 target to support achievement of 2045 climate targets. An updated AB 32 GHG emission inventory, the inventory published in 2022, included an adjustment to align emissions from all sectors with third-party verified data. And staff are continuing to assess updates based on implementation needs and ongoing experience. CARB held 5 workshops and 2 community meetings in 2023 and 2024 to develop concepts aligned with state goals. Over the past year, informed by engagement with stakeholders and the public through the pre-rulemaking process, staff have developed initial concepts for potential updates focusing on increased program stringency and supporting a long-term carbon price signal aligned with the state's 2045 climate targets, review of market rules and cost containment features in the context of allowance budget adjustments to support liquidity, enhance market protections, and ensure transparent pricing. Account for evolution of electricity sector in the Western US, and updates to minimize emissions leakage and continue to support decarbonization and innovation in California's industrial sector and fuel sector. And updates to offset credit provisions and protocols to streamline implementation and reflect best available science. This slide summarizes cumulative allowance budgets and reductions for allowance budget scenarios discussed in the pre-rulemaking workshops to date. These scenarios reflect GHG inventory updates and are consistent with GHG emissions reduction targets of either 40, 48, or 55% below 1990 levels in 2030. The proposed scenario in the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, assessed allowance budgets consistent with the 48% 2030 target. For the 48% scenario, the cumulative reductions through 2030 are approximately 265 million allowances, and the total 2021 through 2045 cumulative budget is approximately 3,795 million allowances. For the 2021 through 2045 cumulative budgets shown here, the post-2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value that is consistent with the emissions reduction target for the scenario to a 2045 cap of 30.3 million allowances. CARB released the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, on April 9th. The SRIA represents an initial economic evaluation of potential changes to the program and is prepared using the best information available, but may not reflect precise real-world potential impact. CARB emphasizes the SRIA is not a staff proposal for amendments, but is one of many steps CARB must take prior to updating the regulation. This slide illustrates how the SRIA proposed Scenario A achieved the cumulative budget and allowance removals for the 48% reduction scenario in annual budgets that could be adopted into the regulation. In the SRIA proposed Scenario A, the entire 2021 through 2030 cumulative reduction of 265 million allowances is achieved by removing allowances from 2025 through 2030 budget years. Then the post-2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value that is consistent with the 2030 emission reduction target of 173 million MT/CO2e. This framework results in a significant increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031, and annual budgets remain higher than 2030 through 2033. Allowance budget changes impact cap adjustment factors. Since the inception of the program, the cap adjustment factors have been calculated proportional to annual budgets. Annual declines in annual budgets are reflected in proportional decreases in the standard cap adjustment factor. Currently, the standard cap adjustment factor decreases to 0.511 by 2030, with an average of 4% from 2021 through 2030. The change in cap adjustment factors is a direct result of changes to the annual allowance budgets. The table shows cap adjustment factors resulting from Scenario B from the SRIA as an illustrative example. Cap adjustment factors impact allowance distribution to the market. Cap adjustment factors scale allowance allocation to most entity types, including natural gas suppliers, industrial entities, universities, and legacy contract generators. The figure shows estimated allowance distribution through 2030 under the current regulation. Allowance allocations scaled by cap adjustment factors are highlighted in the yellow and green striped bars. Electrical distribution utility, or EDU, allocation, shown in the solid dark blue bars, is not scaled by the cap adjustment factor in the regulation. EDU allocation is determined by anticipated compliance costs of the utility. Allowances are distributed to the market by a variety of approaches to serve different purposes. Scaling allocation by cap adjustment factors ensures no sector or use of allowances receives a disproportionate share of limited budgets. EDU allocation declines due to increasing requirements to procure renewable and zero carbon electricity which have no compliance costs in the program. Cap and trade program allowances are distributed in a manner to help achieve the requirements of AB 32 and AB 398 and the goals of the program. The figure shows estimated relative allowance budget distribution from 2025 through 2030 under the current regulation. CARB staff estimate approximately 45% of allowances would be sold at quarterly auctions. Proceeds from state-owned allowances funds are invested in communities and other state priorities via California Climate Investments Program and the Community Air Protection Program. A slightly smaller proportion of allowances would likely be allocated to electrical and natural gas utilities for ratepayer protection. Based on historic production, CARB staff roughly estimate approximately 12% of allowances would be allocated to industry to minimize leakage. 2% of allowances from 2025 through 2030 annual budgets are already allocated to the Allowance Price Containment Reserve, which provides for cost containment and supports program compliance while avoiding price spikes. Cap and trade is the main source of funding for the California Climate Investments Program and has provided 90% of state funding for the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program. California Climate Investments is a statewide initiative that invests proceeds from the sale of state-owned allowances into programs and projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve public health and the environment in California. Through November 2023, over 76% of the $11 billion that has been spent has been directed to priority populations, including disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and low-income households. Cumulatively, California Climate Investments projects will reduce an estimated 109 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and over 106,000 tons of criteria air pollutants. Projects range from clean transportation to affordable housing and sustainable communities, from waste diversion to conserving or restoring natural and working lands, and more. California Climate Investments reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide benefits to Californians through a diversity of projects across the state. Okay, we will now turn to some topics related to utility allocation and use of allowance value. CARB allocates free allowances to electrical distribution utilities, or EDUs, and natural gas suppliers, or NGS, for the protection and benefit of their ratepayers, consistent with the goals of AB 32. We've received feedback on EDU and NGS allocation ideas presented at prior workshops, and we are re-raising this topic in the context of the total potential allowance budgets evaluated in the SRIA to provide additional context around utility allocation and the use of allocated allowance auction proceeds. The number of allowances allocated to each EDU is based on its anticipated cap and trade program compliance costs. The EDU allocation calculation method uses each utility's demand and supply forecasts. Each EDU is assumed to meet mandated RPS requirements. For EDUs with industrial covered entity customers, the calculated cost burden is reduced to account for emissions associated with industrial covered entities' purchased electricity. Allocation to individual EDUs may vary from year to year, but allocation to the EDU sector as a whole declines over time, aligned with decarbonizing supply and decreasing program budgets. The number of allowances allocated to each NGS each year is calculated based on its 2011 covered emissions and the annually declining cap adjustment factor. For EDUs, investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, must consign all allocated allowances to auction, while publicly owned utilities and cooperatives, or POUs and co-ops, choose what proportion of their allocated allowances are deposited directly for compliance. In contrast, all natural gas suppliers, both IOUs and POUs, must consign a minimum percentage of their allocated allowances to auction, with the remainder deposited directly for compliance. This minimum consignment percentage is 70% in 2024, and it increases 5% per year, so it will reach 100% in 2030. When allowances are consigned to auction, more of an EDU or NGS's program cost burden is passed through to consumers in rates. At the same time, The auction proceeds from the consigned allowances are used to benefit ratepayers and reduce GHG emissions without blunting the incentive for energy conservation and fuel switching. We believe at this time that the EDU allocation more than covers any cap and trade costs passed through to ratepayers. Furthermore, CARB's 2022 scoping plan projects broad deployment of zero carbon electricity and electrification of residential and commercial heating needs to reach carbon neutrality for the utility sector by 2045. Staff is evaluating updates to the EDU and NGS allocation in the context of overall program allowance budgets, the most up-to-date program calculations for EDUs, and expected residential and commercial electrification. Here is an example for illustrative purposes of a comparison of the current projected allowance budget distribution from 2025 through 2030 and the proposed allowance budget distribution for 2025 through 2030, analyzed under proposed scenario B from the SRIA. Several utilities have requested that EDUs keep the same allocation that is in the current regulation. It is important to note that the overall program allowance budgets will decrease. Further, recent supply data indicates that EDUs will face lower program costs due to increasing renewable and zero carbon sources of electricity with time, and we know that there will be increased pressure on the electric system due to expected electrification. Staff is evaluating all these factors to best meet the multiple goals and requirements of the program. Staff is requesting feedback on the following. Is the current EDU and NGS allocation sufficiently aligned to promote state electrification goals? And how should EDU and NGS allocation be set post-2030 given decreasing program allowance budgets? Most EDU and NGS allocated allowances are consigned to auction, and the auction proceeds must be either directly distributed to ratepayers or spent on projects that reduce GHG emissions within the utility's service territory. The cap and trade regulation includes specific requirements and limitations for how allocated allowance value can be used. A majority of EDU and NGS allocated allowance value is returned to ratepayers in the form of California climate credits. These credits are non-volumetric, meaning they are not tied to the amount of electricity or natural gas consumed, and each of the utility's eligible ratepayers receive the same credit amount. Climate credits are an essential tool to protect ratepayers while maintaining the carbon price signal and preserving the appropriate incentives for energy conservation and fuel switching. A smaller portion of EDU and NGS allowance value is used for GHG reduction projects. For EDUs, prior uses include community solar incentives provided through the SOMA program and a variety of local POU clean energy projects such as electric vehicle chargers. For natural gas suppliers, prior uses include IOU building electrification incentives provided through the Build and Tech programs, POU programs for energy efficient appliances, and IOU incentives for biomethane pipeline interconnection projects. All utilities must use allocated allowance value for ratepayer benefit as specified in the cap and trade regulation. The regulation currently places a number of limitations on EDU and NGS use of allocated allowance value. Allowance value must be used to benefit the utility's own ratepayers, either through non-volumetric return or eligible GHG reduction projects. Specific prohibited uses of allowance value include regulatory compliance costs, lobbying costs, employee bonuses, shareholder dividends, and return to ratepayers in a volumetric manner. Uses of POU and electrical co-op auction proceeds are determined by their governing bodies in conformance with the cap and trade regulation. In addition to meeting the regulation requirements, IOUs also comply with statutory and CPUC decisions for the use of auction proceeds. CARB staff is considering targeted regulatory concepts to ensure that EDU and NGS allowance value used outside of the climate credits are for GHG reduction activities. For natural gas suppliers, CARB staff is considering whether there should be additional limitations on eligible GHG projects to bring all allowable uses in line with scoping plan measures for the natural gas sector, such as building electrification. Okay, CARB staff is requesting feedback on the following. Should CARB revisit the use of allowance value by natural gas suppliers? And should there be any additional limitations on the type of GHG reduction projects that can be funded with EDU or NGS allocated allowance value? And with that, I will pass to my colleague, Camille Sultana, who will present on industrial allocation topics. Camille.
Thank you, Michael. So I will present on industrial allowance allocation and program efforts to further support decarbonizing California's industrial and manufacturing sectors. Pursuant to AB 32 and AB 398, CARB designed the Cap and Trade program to minimize the potential for emissions leakage. Emissions leakage is a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in state with a corresponding increase in out-of-state greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial allocation is CARB's primary approach to addressing industrial leakage and an approach common to all similar programs throughout the world that cover industrial sources. Most industrial allocation is calculated using the output-based allocation methodology. This allocation method incentivizes efficient production within California by calculating the amount of allocated allowances using facility output multiplied by a product benchmark and scaled by the cap adjustment and assistance factors. Staff is evaluating industrial allocation given California's ambitious mid-century decarbonization targets established by AB 1279, evolution of industrial sectors, and implementation experience. Since program inception, over 98% of industrial allocation has been by the output-based method, which relies on the one product, one benchmark principle. This principle avoids product benchmarks and definitions that are differentiated by technology, fuel mix, size, age, climatic circumstances, or raw material quality of the installations producing the product. The one product, one benchmark approach supports program goals by appropriately rewarding relatively low greenhouse gas production of products within a sector, ensuring all greenhouse gas emissions abatement options remain viable and receive consistent incentives, including switches to different technologies, fuels, and feedstocks, and providing consistent treatment to all facilities for production of a specified product. California's industrial sectors are now rapidly evolving and will continue to transform as facilities reduce emissions, employ innovative low greenhouse gas production methods, and shift production to new low carbon fuels and materials for the decarbonization of California's broader economy. Given this ongoing transition and aligned with the program's one product, one benchmark approach, staff are considering revising existing product definitions and product benchmarks for cement manufacturing, crude oil production, and transportation fuel production sectors to ensure the program appropriately incentivizes low greenhouse gas production methods and provides consistent treatment for innovative methods of supplying California with fuels and materials. The next several slides discuss cement sector allocation. The main component of cement is clinker. Clinker provides the sticky properties for cement and is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions during cement production. Clinker produced at cement plants is blended with gypsum, limestone, and additives, and then shipped to cement users such as concrete plants that may add additional supplementary cementitious materials or SCMs to finish cement. Currently, the regulation provides allowance allocation for adjusted clinker and mineral additives, gypsum and limestone produced by incumbent cement plants. However, there is an increasing array of alternative low-carbon materials being added to make new types of cements and to decarbonize cement. Staff are evaluating potential updates to cement allocation to consider treating cement that uses alternative materials the same as conventional cement if it is produced in California and meets equivalent performance requirements. This is in line with the one product, one benchmark principle. And also adjusting allowance allocation for the cement sector to accommodate alternative materials. Staff is evaluating the potential to provide allocation for cement that incorporates alternative low carbon materials. This slide provides an overview of that initial concept. Currently, California cement producers produce clinker by treating limestone with high heat. Clinker is then mixed with mineral additives to become cement. Cement producers are covered by the program and receive allocation for adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced. To enable allocation for alternative clinker, adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced can be modified to include alternative clinker. This would enable producers of alternative clinker to be treated the same as incumbent cement producers. For SCMs, it's possible that SCMs produced in California are delivered to cement plants and then blended with clinker and mineral additives to become cement. Staff understands that this is not a common practice today. SCMs can also be delivered to cement users, mainly ready mixed concrete producers, and then blended there with cement received from cement producers to become finished cement. Finished cement will be mixed with other ingredients to become concrete. Blending by cement users is how most, if not all, SCM blending occurs in California today. Adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced by cement producers could include both incumbent and alternative cement producers and SCMs produced in California that are used to make finished cement. Together, this finished cement would be eligible for allocation. The existing product definition for cement sector allocation is adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced. The existing benchmark is 0.742 metric tons CO2e per short ton of adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced. Staff's initial thinking is to update adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced to include both limestone-based clinker and low carbon alternative clinker that satisfies performance requirements equal to limestone-based clinker. Additionally, staff are considering incorporating a new definition for finished cement, which would be the sum of adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced and SCMs blended to finished cement. The benchmark for finished cement could potentially remain the same as the existing cement benchmark of 0.742 metric tons CO2e per short ton of product. Incumbent cement producers, alternative cement producers, and SCM producers all produce components of finished cement. Such entities operating in California could potentially opt into the program, if not covered, to receive allowance allocation for producing finished cement. Staff is soliciting feedback on this initial concept for modifying cement allocation. Should alternative clinker and SCMs be eligible for allocation under the cement allocation framework? If so, how should the definitions of cement, adjusted clinker and mineral additives produced be modified? And what NICS codes reflect industrial production of the range of materials that are under consideration? Staff are also seeking to understand if SCMs are eligible for allocation and who should receive allocation for SCM production. Should the SCM producer receive allocation, or could that risk double counting? Alternatively, could there be benefits to providing allocation at the point where SCMs are blended into finished cement? For SCMs, it is feasible that for one party to report verifiable information on the amount of SCMs shipped from SCM producers and received by users to make cement. Would multiple parties need to report to ensure accuracy? We'll now move on to a discussion of allocation for crude oil extraction within California. Currently, output-based allocation is provided for crude oil extraction using two benchmarks differentiated by production method. The thermal EOR crude oil extraction benchmark is 0.0811 allowances per barrel of oil equivalent. The non-thermal crude oil extraction benchmark is over an order of magnitude less at 0.0076 allowances per barrel of oil equivalent. Upon adoption of these benchmarks, CARB staff committed in rulemaking documents to monitoring the evolution of the oil and gas sector. Since 2012, the cap and trade and MRR implementation and data indicate that crude oil extraction is not clearly bimodal in practice or in emissions intensity, and the complexity of oil field operations and geology may contribute to inconsistent reporting and verification of thermal production. During the July 27 workshop, staff presented an initial discussion of California crude oil extraction and benchmarks, and requested feedback on alternative approaches to allocation for oil extraction. As discussed throughout our pre-rulemaking workshops, staff are considering a broad array of amendments to ensure the program aligns with California's long-term decarbonization goals and with the 2022 scoping plan update, which indicates that transformations are needed across California's economy this decade. The program must ensure that it incents low greenhouse gas production across all of California's industrial sectors, inclusive of any remaining fossil fuel production in California. Given these objectives, staff have an initial concept where to, starting with vintage 2031, allocate for crude oil extraction using a newly calculated single benchmark for produced barrel of oil equivalent. The newly calculated benchmark would use the same aggregated California oil producer data as the existing thermal and non-thermal benchmarks, providing a similar level of overall leakage protection to the sector. This potential approach is technology agnostic, aligned with the program's one product, one benchmark principle, rewards low greenhouse gas production and investments within California, and provides consistent treatment of all entities within the sector. To provide time for covered entities to prepare for this revision to the product benchmark, staff are considering implementing this benchmark in vintage year 2031. Staff requests feedback on: should the allocation for crude oil extraction be aligned with the one product, one benchmark principle? The transportation fuel sector remains the largest source. The transportation sector remains the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California. The 2022 scoping plan lays out a path to reduce petroleum fuel demand by 94% by 2045. CARB has adopted regulations such as Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, and Advanced Clean Fleets that will transition California to clean zero emissions vehicles, thus tackling the largest source of local air pollution in many overburdened communities. Despite these efforts, there will be ongoing demand for liquid fuels from legacy combustion engines in the on-road, aviation, and off-road sources. To meet this demand with lower carbon and cleaner burning fuels, petroleum refineries in California have already converted to producing biogenic transportation fuels. Renewable diesel is a drop-in hydrocarbon fuel functionally equivalent to petroleum diesel, but derived from biogenic rather than fossil crude oil feedstocks. See the July 27, 2023 workshop for an initial discussion of biogenic and petroleum transportation fuel production and allocation under the program. Under the current regulation, petroleum refineries receive allocation for the activity of petroleum refining, using complexity weighted barrel as the output metric. The CWB benchmark is a process-based technology-specific approach and is difficult to extend to biogenic fuel producers. The CWB benchmark incentivizes operation of existing refining process units in an efficient manner, but it does not recognize the emerging variety of greenhouse gas lowering activities. The allocation provisions in the current regulation are not well positioned to accommodate California's ongoing expansion of biogenic fuel production, particularly for renewable diesel facilities that also produce hydrogen. Staff has also identified that maintaining the CWB method long-term for petroleum refining, while allocating to other facilities already producing functionally equivalent fuels with new process or feedstock-specific benchmarks, may provide inconsistent treatment of the transportation fuel sector and inconsistent incentives for low greenhouse gas production. Staff are considering changes to address the emissions leakage risk faced by converted refineries producing functionally equivalent biogenic fuels, while also ensuring consistent and strong incentives for low greenhouse gas production across the transportation fuel sector. To achieve these goals, staff have developed an initial concept where transportation fuel producers are allocated using a liquid hydrocarbon fuel framework based on the total production of motor gasoline blend stocks, diesel, jet fuel, finished hydrocarbon gas liquids, and any functionally equivalent non-fossil hydrocarbon fuels or blending components. Staff are considering a phased-in approach where allocation for liquid hydrocarbon fuel production is immediately available to facilities producing 100% biogenic fuels. Petroleum refineries may receive allocation based on CWB through vintage 2030. Starting with vintage 2031, all applicable transportation fuel producers are allocated based on the liquid hydrocarbon fuel production. Staff would develop a new benchmark using existing high-quality data reported by already covered facilities, enabling ready allocation for production of biogenic hydrocarbon transportation fuel. To support this liquid hydrocarbon fuel concept, staff would also consider developing a separate benchmark for asphalt production, a major finished product of some refineries, which differs significantly in process and final product from transportation fuels. This liquid hydrocarbon fuel approach would be technology agnostic, align with the one product, one benchmark principle, reward low greenhouse gas production and investments within California, and provide consistent treatment of all entities within the sector. This framework would also provide a similar level of leakage risk protection to the petroleum refining sector as the current CWB approach, while providing stronger incentives for low greenhouse gas production and rewarding investments in a wider array of greenhouse gas lowering activities. The phased-in approach would enable near-term allocation after amendments are effective for biogenic fuel production using a benchmark based on high-quality California data. Staff's initial concept provides an adjustment period for petroleum refineries, while ensuring the whole sector transitions to a consistent allocation approach for petroleum refineries, biogenic fuel producers, co-processing facilities, and emerging fuel production methods. Staff requests feedback on this initial concept, including what products should or should not be included under a potential liquid hydrocarbon fuel framework, Do applicable facilities have significant production of any finished products that may not be included in a liquid hydrocarbon fuel framework? Are there existing reporting methods, such as state or federal programs, that could support MRR reporting and verification of produced fuels? How should facilities engaged in production of both biogenic and fossil transportation fuels be allocated to during any phase-in period? And should petroleum refineries be able to transition early to allocation based on liquid hydrocarbon fuel production? I think we may want to take a technical break at this time. Mark?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I understand we're having some challenges with having our second interpreter get connected. So in order to give our interpretation services a brief break and to ensure that our second interpreter can join, we're going to take a 5-minute break right now, and then we'll rejoin with the remainder of the presentation slides and the Q&A session. So we will plan to be back in just about 5 minutes once we get the connection issue resolved. Thank you. Hi all, welcome back after the 5-minute break. I believe we have resolved the issues with the connectivity for the interpretation services. So we have both of our Spanish interpreters available. I am now going to hand it back to Camille Sultana for the remainder of the cap and trade related slides. And following that, there'll be some mandatory reporting regulation related content from Smidar Levy, and then we'll have question and answers. Back to you, Camille.
Thank you, Mark. Are we? Sorry, there we go. Okay. So during the July 27, 2023 workshop, staff introduced a proposal to directly allocate to industrial covered entities to address carbon cost associated with purchased electricity. Currently, the California Public Utilities Commission, or CPUC, is responsible for implementing the California Industry Assistance Program for customers of IOUs to minimize the leakage risk from program cost in electricity purchases. The CPUC method mirrors CARB's industrial allocation approach. This proposal would complete the transition to transfer the administrative process of this leakage protection mechanism from CPUC to CARB. Staff is considering an allocation method that would mirror current output-based and energy-based allocation approaches. This is an administrative change only, and transitioning this leakage prevention from CPUC to CARB would provide no change in the level of leakage protection provided to industrial facilities in IOU service territory. Industrial facilities in POU service territory do not currently receive this leakage protection. With this change, POU customers would receive the same treatment and leakage protection as IOU customers. If implemented, CARB would publish in the regulation the electricity efficiency benchmarks. These benchmarks would use the same facility data and data years that were used in the current product benchmarks published in the Cap and Trade regulation. The goal of this approach is to provide the same level of transparency as other benchmarks. We'll now move on to a brief discussion of some limited topics regarding emissions coverage. All fuel ethanol blended in transportation fuels contains a specified concentration of fossil fuel denaturant. However, currently all fuel ethanol supplied by transportation fuel suppliers is reported as 100% biogenic ethanol, and all associated CO2 emissions from the reported fuel ethanol volume, including fossil denaturant, are exempt under cap and trade. Staff are considering amending MRR so that supplied fuel ethanol appropriately accounts for the volume of fossil fuel denaturant and removing CO2 exemption for ethanol fossil denaturant from cap and trade. Staff requests feedback on this concept, specifically, should fuel ethanol be reported as 2.5% fossil denaturant, consistent with US federal limits on denaturants and denatured fuel ethanol, or should more specific reporting on fossil denaturant content be required? In 2018, Board Resolution 1851 requested staff to consider an exemption through 2030 for fuel cells connected to existing natural gas infrastructure where there are demonstrated local air quality benefits. Staff request feedback on how this exemption should be applied. Emissions from eligible biomass-derived fuels such as biomethane are already exempt in the program, and this exemption is only considering fossil fuel-powered fuel cell units. Should this exempt facilities that would not have been covered in the program, but for their installation of a fossil fuel powered fuel cell unit? Should the criteria to be eligible for this exemption be linked to other programs or standards, such as the Stationary Fuel Cell Net Energy Metering Greenhouse Gas Standard, or not allowed where fossil gas is utilized? Extreme heat events constrain the state's electricity infrastructure and overwhelm the state power supply. During an extreme heat event in 2022, the governor proclaimed a state of emergency, calling for a temporary increase in energy production and temporarily suspended permitting requirements to support grid reliability. Consistent with the executive order, staff is evaluating a potential provision to exempt non covered electricity generating facilities from a compliance obligation if their covered emissions exceed the 25,000 metric ton inclusion threshold solely due to increased electricity production during a state of emergency. In such a scenario, the compliance obligation associated with natural gas combustion for electricity generation would continue to be assessed at the natural gas supplier level. Staff requests feedback on: should CARB continue this type of exemption for emergency generation aligned with the overall requirements in Executive Order N-14-22? I'll now pass the presentation to Smadar Levy, staff within the Mandatory Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reporting, or MRR program, to discuss potential updates to MRR reporting requirements. Take it away, Smadar.
So I'm going to talk first about non-fossil transportation fuels. The current point of regulation under MRR for transportation fuel suppliers consists of refiners, position holders at terminal racks, and enterers that import fossil fuels outside the bulk transfer system. This point of regulation does not fully capture non-fossil transportation fuels supplied outside the bulk transfer system, particularly biodiesel. In addition, the regulation does not currently require transportation fuel suppliers to report data for novel non-fossil fuels, such as non-fossil gasoline blend stocks. Given the evolving supply of transportation biofuels in California, staff seeks to update MRR to completely and accurately capture emissions from non-fossil transportation fuels and collect data to assess if non-fossil transportation fuels are being fully and accurately reported under MRR. Given these objectives, staff is considering amending MRR to add enterers and in-state producers of non-fossil fuels that supply outside the bulk transfer terminal system to the transportation fuel supplier point of regulation, add additional data reporting requirements for non-fossil fuels subject to emissions reporting, and add non-fossil motor gasoline blend stocks and non-fossil LPG, or liquefied petroleum gas, as regulated transportation fuels. Staff requests feedback on these concepts. Specifically, do importers and in-state producers of non-fossil transportation fuels anticipate difficulties with determining or documenting the volume of non-fossil fuels delivered outside of the bulk system? Within MRR, the definition for, quote, importer of fuel, or IOF, establishes the point of regulation for importers of liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied natural gas, and compressed natural gas. In the last few years, LPG importers have expressed difficulty determining whether they are the importer of fuel in cases where LPG is being imported into California from other states in the US, especially when LPG is imported from storage facilities, which is becoming more common. Like other suppliers, importers of fuel have a reporting threshold of 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. To simplify reporting and provide flexibility to LPG importers while continuing to comprehensively capture emissions from LPG in California, MRR staff proposed to revise the importer of fuel definition to mean the owner of imported LPG, CNG, or LNG as it enters California, and changed the annual reporting threshold for importers of LPG from 10,000 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent to 100,800 gallons of imported LPG, which is about 3 rail cars worth of fuel or 587 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. No change is proposed to the reporting threshold for LNG or CNG importers. These changes would make it easier to determine and verify which entity holds the reporting responsibility for an import, because the owner of the fuel as it enters California is clearly documented in contracts or other financial records. The proposed point of regulation would also provide entities with flexibility, because the owner of the fuel at the point of regulation can be negotiated between parties. Regardless of which entity owns the fuel at the California border, reducing the reporting threshold would ensure that the vast majority of emissions from imported LPG continues to be reported under MRR. At the same time, setting a minimum threshold of 3 rail cars would prevent very small businesses, individuals, and emergency shipments from being pulled into MRR reporting. Staff requests some feedback on this topic. For importers of LPG, will the proposed threshold capture almost all LPG imports into California? What are the incentives and disincentives for current LPG importers to retain the obligation to report, given the additional flexibility in the proposed point of regulation? For importers of LNG or CNG, are there any anticipated impacts from a revised importer of fuel definition? Currently, hydrogen production facilities in California only report under MRR if their emissions exceed 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, and they are subject to cap and trade when their covered emissions exceed 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, similar to other industrial facilities. The hydrogen production facilities that currently report to MRR all generate hydrogen via steam methane reformation. Staff are considering amendments to expand reporting requirements to capture additional types of hydrogen production facilities. These amendments are needed to support CARB's scoping plan goals to grow renewable hydrogen production by 1,700 times by 2045, as well as to potentially track the types and scaling of hydrogen coming online. Staff seeks input on what additional reporting requirements would be necessary to support reporting from in-state electrolytic hydrogen production, biomass or biogas-based hydrogen production, and additional hydrogen production technologies with emissions below the MRR threshold, as well as from importers of hydrogen. Okay, natural gas infrastructure emissions reporting. Emissions reporting for natural gas systems under MRR has not been significantly updated since its initial incorporation. Notably, vented emissions from natural gas transmission pipelines are not currently reported to MRR, but this category was incorporated into the US GHG EPA reporting in 2014. Staff are considering incorporating blowdown emissions reporting for transmission pipelines into MRR, aligned with US EPA reporting. MRR staff are also seeking to improve understanding of reported emissions from natural gas systems. Towards this goal, staff request feedback on the following. How do reporting entities determine emissions from pipeline dig-ins? Are any emission sources reported under Section 95152 also captured in emissions reported by natural gas suppliers under Section 95122? If so, which ones and to what extent? In the next couple of slides, I will discuss initial staff thinking concerning cement imports and MRR. AB 398 was adopted in 2017 and requires CARB to evaluate the potential for a border carbon adjustment, which is a mechanism that applies a carbon price on imported goods. One example is the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will start placing a carbon price on certain emissions-intensive imports in 2026. Starting in 2013 and 2014, staff evaluated the potential for a possible border carbon adjustment for cement, whose manufacturing is associated with high emissions intensity and high leakage risk, and is also a relatively uniform product with a less complex supply chain. Given these factors and past analysis, staff is reevaluating the potential for a border carbon adjustment for this sector. And as a first step in this evaluation is considering requiring cement importers to report GHG emissions and additional information associated with imported cement under MRR. The in-state cement production sector has been reporting GHG emissions and production information to CARB under MRR since 2008. It is staff's understanding that there is a relatively small number of cement importers. Staff know of 5 cement importers who operate 13 terminals in the state. There was about 2.5 million metric tons of cement imported into California in 2021. Given the limited number of importers and the quantity of imported products, it would be reasonable to collect GHG emissions information associated with imported cement. Staff have developed an initial concept where cement importers as a sector would be required to report to MRR. Given the complexity of assessing GHG emissions associated with products not manufactured in California, staff is considering a transitional period during which reported data would not be subject to verification. During a transitional period, cement importers would report the amount of cement imported and its emissions intensity using the best available quantification methodologies. Staff is seeking feedback on the following topics. Who should be required to report imported cement data to MRR? As previously mentioned, there are currently 5 cement importers at 13 port terminals. Could the operators of the terminals be required to report to MRR? What kinds of reporting methodologies could be allowed during a transitional period? Ideally, data would be collected using reporting methods as rigorous as MRR. However, it is staff's understanding that cement plants in other countries use reporting tools with varying levels of vigor or may not track GHG emissions at all. Staff is also aware that a significant number of cement producers in the world voluntarily report GHG emissions information to the Global Cement and Concrete Association's Getting the Numbers Right project. There may be other methodologies that are comparable to MRR requirements. If no facility-specific GHG emissions data from cement producing plants are available, it may be possible for importers to use a default emissions factor per ton of imported cement. Also, which products or materials should be included in cement, as it could be made up of clinker, alternative clinker, gypsum, limestone, and SCMs. Could imported cement be reported disaggregated by component materials? Lastly, should verification be required initially or phased in? Okay. We'll now open up the workshop for public comment. If you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button, proceed to introduce yourself, and provide your comment. To accommodate as many people as we can, comments today are limited to 2 minutes, and there is no ceding time to others. Please reference the timer on the top right of the slide for time remaining. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until June 14th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback, as well as all relevant documents, on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. With that, I will now pass the mic to my colleague, Cypress Figueroa, who will be facilitating the public comment session.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We will get started on our public comment session today. Our first commenter is Michael Scavarla. Michael, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, my name is Mikhail Scavarla. I'm with CA Lobby. I got a question with regard to kind of the specificity of having different reporting requirements for different fuel types and technologies, and why we're moving away from a volumetric reporting system, and kind of, is this just preliminary thinking, or what's kind of the motivation and impetus for this beyond just having a tech neutral volumetric requirement that MRR covers today?
Hey, Mick,
Thank you, Michael.
Mick, can I have you, I hope you're still unmuted and able to speak, but can I have you just clarify exactly what specifically, like, technology or volume you're referring to?
As you guys were running through the slides, it appeared as though a number of biogenic fuels were being contemplated for reporting requirements based on different metrics, as opposed to the 10,000 metric ton trigger for MRR reporting. And I'm kind of curious why we would move away from something that is kind of agnostic on fuel type versus calling out specific fuels for different reporting requirements, such as I think you had stuff for RNG and renewable diesel and hydrogen, and liquid propane gas that are different reporting requirement than that 10,000. Potentially lowering that threshold. I understand for kind of continuity or the ability to track on imports, but I'm curious at the facility level if this is more just to why would we have a trigger below the 10,000 metric tons for different technologies?
So
Understood. And so I believe that is geared towards LPG. This is related to the mandatory reporting regulation, so I might want to defer to the MRR staff ultimately, but I see Rajinder jumping in as well.
Yeah, we're not changing any of the triggers for most of the fuels. We still have the 10,000 reporting threshold and we still have the 25,000. There are already existing requirements that small amounts of even electricity have to be reported below that. And this is just a recognition that there are different points of entry for fuels and different ways that they can enter the system in California. So in general, it's just making minor tweaks to certain fuels where we feel like the overall points of regulation warrant trying to capture that fuel coming into the state economy, and it might be coming in lower volumes. So it's not really trying to differentiate or trying to put different requirements on different types of fuels. It's just trying to be more comprehensive to make sure we're capturing all of the fuels in the various ways that they come in.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. We will now hear from Ignacio Fernandez. Ignacio, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the presentation you gave us this morning. My name is Ignacio Fernandez, and on behalf of Southern California Edison, I just want to, rather than provide comments, I wanted to ask a clarifying question. In the presentation, you guys stated that the SRIA proposal is not a CARB staff proposal, and provided some information on how to estimate or how to adjust the allocation for allowances for EDUs. Can you provide more specific on that estimate on how to calculate which vintage of the IPER load forecast are you going to use, and specifics about the RPS requirements adjusted to the current statute, but in what percentage? Can you provide more details at this point? That's all. Thank you.
So I'm going to start, and I think Rachel can help jump in here. What we did in the SRIA was an early snapshot of where we think we could go, where we're taking a straight reading of how we've done allocation in the past and how that would apply under the different scenarios in the SRIA as we think about changes to the caps for the rest of this decade and post 2030. As we've continued to meet with all stakeholders, including the utilities, we know that there are requests to think about other considerations such as electrification as being more beneficial than things such as fossil gas combustion, thinking about the load growth that needs to happen there. And so we're continuing to work through the specifics about how that would actually play out for a formal staff proposal for a 45-day package. But I don't know if, Rachel, you or the team have anything specific that you'd like to share at this time. I know you're still working through a lot of the comments we got there.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Rajinder, and thanks for the question, Ignacio. In that SRIA look, we did look at updating using the latest IPER forecast for both supply data and demand forecasts, and generally feel like those were the 2022, 2023 vintage amounts. Just want to note that, and applying a 60% RPS in 2030 to those forecasts using the existing methodology in the current allocation, which is decreased by 5% as it scales over time. So happy to follow up about those details, and thanks for the question.
Thank you. We will now hear from Krista Weiner. Krista, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hello, Krista Warner on behalf of Western Propane Gas Association. As requested in our previous comment letter, WPGA requests and supports that renewable propane and other biogenic fuels developed as liquefied petroleum gas substitutes be exempt from the rulemaking. Propane being currently not exempted from the program adds significant costs onto the renewable energy source. The state of Washington and its Captain Invest program recognizes this already. We believe that CARB is moving in this direction with the updated concept and look forward to providing more in-depth comment in our future letter. Propane is also a vital fuel in hard to de-electrify regions of the state and is especially necessary to provide backup generation during power outages and peak demands. We look forward to adding comment on the draft concept surrounding on-site generation exemptions included here today. We are also concerned about the draft concept surrounding the shift of reporting requirement from importer to owner of LPG as submitted in today's slides. This threshold would be inclusive of most propane marketers within California, inclusive of small businesses CARB is seeking to hold harmless. We look forward to working with staff on resolving our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Really appreciate the immediate feedback here, and we look forward to receiving and reviewing your comments, and we'll be available for discussion about things like the threshold topic that you raised with our MRR colleagues. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you. We will now hear from Ken Johnson. Ken, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
I'm Ken Johnson. I'm with the Climate Reality Project, Silicon Valley chapter. And I just have a quick question about cement. There's no mention of SB 596. And I was wondering, should a lot of these questions about cement be addressed in the SB 596 process? And also, can you give us any information about what the current status is of SB 596? Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And certainly there is some overlap on the cement questions that we're talking about here in SB 596. But with AB 398 and the explicit direction to look at a carbon border adjustment there, and given that we had already done some preliminary work in 2014 and 15, it all begins with the reporting. So we believe that whether it's 596 in the future or following through on the direction AB 398, we need to look at how to collect that data and what that data collection and scope of reporting looks like. So we're teeing that up here in the context of the mandatory reporting regulation. SB 596 calls for some very tight turnarounds on a report from CARB. We are still working through that process. As you may be aware, most stakeholders are aware, when legislation is signed, it can take up to a year for us to actually get resources to do the work that was signed into law the previous session. So we continue to work through and make progress on SB 596. We've got a webpage dedicated to it. We've had some workshops, but we will be following up later this summer towards fall with draft reports under that statute. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Sarah Tahiri. Sarah, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Sarah Tahiri, representing San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Gas Company. SDG&E and SoCal Gas appreciate the presentation today. We'll be providing some more specific detail and follow-up and written comments responding to the requested feedback areas. But for now, I wanted to just provide some high-level remarks to address the utility allowance allocation discussion. To date, the Cap and Trade program has recognized the importance of providing utility customer protections and has addressed this in the form of directly allocated allowances. This was well articulated in staff's presentation today. I want to emphasize that the revenues generated from the sale of utility allowances are returned directly back to utility customers. Historically, this has occurred either in the form of the California Climate Credit or via programs that align with the state's carbon reduction goals, a testament to our commitment. To be specific, last month, SoCal Gas customers received a $73 bill credit for their 2024 gas climate credit. SDG&E customers will receive a total of approximately $215 for their 2024 gas and electric climate credits. As the scoping plan acknowledged, California will need an all tools on the table approach, utilizing electrification and clean fuels to meet our shared decarbonization goals. Clean, reliable, and affordable energy are imperative to achieving these goals, and utilities will play a key role in facilitating this transition. Preserving utility allowance allocations will help manage costs for utility customers as they embark on their decarbonization journey. We look forward to continued discussions with ARB and other stakeholders on this important element of the program, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Sarah, for the comment. Definitely internally, we recognize the value that the climate credits can bring and appreciate the feedback on this and look forward to continuing that conversation on the utility allocations with your utility and the rest of the utilities that are under the program.
Thanks, Mark. We will now hear from Andre Templeman. Andre, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, just a quick question on slide number 19. And I know it's just at the end of the day, the basic math of the scenario. But when you look at the allocations there on the pie chart, or on, sorry, the bar chart, it seems like the allocations going to the GGRF actually go up as a result of these changes, which seems nonsensical, if you ask me. Even though I know that's only happening because it's the balance of the budget and therefore it's going up. But it just seems economically regressive policy to take out so much allocations from the utility sector while increasing the allocations that go to the GGRF at the same time that the prices are expected to go up dramatically. So if you double the prices, which is sort of what a lot of forecasts show, including mine, between now and the end of the 2030 period, and you're increasing the volume of allowances, then the GGRF gets a massive windfall at the expense of utility commercial customers. That seems nonsensical and seems economically regressive. Am I reading the charts right? I mean, is that essentially what you're proposing? Or is that just a scenario that is showing up, but not really what you're proposing?
So nothing here is an actual proposal. Staff is using illustrative examples from the SRIA. So that is just an example of how things change and can change under specific levers that could be deployed and where we remove allowances from, especially when you look at scenarios A, B, and C, and the 40, 45, 48, and 55 that we looked at in the SRIA. We are not aware of what work you may have done, Andre, so we can't really speak to the comparison with anything you've done. But by the time we put out our 45-day staff proposal, we will be very transparent in how things are changing and shifting and why. And just because we're talking about reducing caps at a certain percentage rate, because the cap adjustment factors don't touch every sector of allocation the same way, there are not going to be equal reductions across all of the sectors, like electricity and natural gas and industry. So again, I don't think there's much to compare or dig into here, because this is illustrative examples so that folks can understand the concepts and see how the different pieces fit together, because it is that closed system. And we'll have very detailed descriptions and comments as part of the final staff proposal or the initial staff proposal that goes out in the coming months. Thanks.
Thank you. We will now hear from Austin Weideman. Austin, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. This is Austin Weideman speaking on behalf of the Southern California Public Power Authority, or SCAPA, consisting of 12 local publicly owned electric utility members. SCAPA members are supporting the state's climate goals, and in many cases, their own local ambitious climate goals. These include rapid transition to clean energy resources and electrification, while prioritizing providing affordable electricity to their communities. To continue successfully anchoring the cap and trade program, it is important that POUs retain allowance allocation and the flexibility of using those allowances to continue creating the positive impacts we've had thus far. CARB set fixed allowance allocations for POUs for 2021 to 2030, with those allowances significantly reducing over the decade. CARB acknowledged the need for fixed allowance allocations for utilities, specifically to incentivize early voluntary actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. With flexible use of allowance value, utilities are able to invest in renewable energy resources and provide customer programs such as direct rebates to customers for electric vehicle chargers, support electrification for buildings and vehicles, projects like community shared solar and home energy improvement programs. Further reducing those allocated allowances would be to the detriment of SCAPA member communities. We urge you to take into consideration the unique and pivotal role that POUs play in successfully achieving the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction and carbon neutrality goals towards reaching the 2022 scoping plan. SCAPA will continue to work with CARB and our POU partners across the state. And thank you again for the opportunity to comment today.
Thanks, Austin. Really appreciate the feedback and highlighting a lot of the good uses that the publicly owned utility allowance value has been put to in the past, and definitely look forward to continuing that conversation with you moving forward.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, we have about 4 hands raised currently, and we will next hear from Faria Ali. Faria, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, this is Faria Ali with Pacific Gas and Electric. I will try not to repeat too much of what my other utility colleagues have already said, but I did want to highlight a couple of things. So PG&E does support a well-designed cap and trade program. We do recognize the need to increase the stringency of that program. And I just want to emphasize that it is going to be critical to strike the right balance on how the program stringency is increased. And as my colleagues have mentioned and as staff highlighted, allocation of free allowances to utilities is exclusively for the benefit of ratepayers, not the utilities themselves. And it really plays a critical role in mitigating the impact of the program on electricity and natural gas costs while still preserving the price signal from the program. I think Sarah gave an example of the climate credit for some of the other IOUs. On the PG&E side, natural gas customers received an $85 credit in April. Electricity customers received $55 in April as well, and we'll get another $55 in October. And removing allowances from the utility allocation will decrease how much revenue will be available for things like the climate credit and other programs that are currently funded. One of the things that we've also talked about is potentially better targeting these revenues to further support low-income customers, but fewer allowances would mean less revenue that could be directed for this purpose. And so we believe that preserving as much of the allocation as to utilities as possible is critical to help support California ratepayers as we transition to a decarbonized economy. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and providing written comments as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Faria. Yeah, really appreciate the feedback. We are looking at a world for the cap and trade program moving forward that's a little more stringent as we remove allowances from the program. Again, highlighting a lot of the good and beneficial purposes is very useful that the utilities have done. And we are facing some challenging decisions related to that more constrained world with less allowances, and how the within each budget those allowances get put to use. So these are challenging conversations, and thanks for highlighting the positives that your utilities have been able to see through the use.
Thank you. We will now hear from Denise Cathy. Denise, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, Denise Kathy, Argus Media. I had just had a point of clarification. So within the allocation adjustments for transportation fuels and crude oil extraction, we see a start date of 2031. Is there an expected timeline for when the changes for cement and EDU allocations would kick in, or is that along the same timeline?
So that is a great question, and we're still working through those pieces. Obviously, when we're talking about removing a significant amount of allowances before 2030, we have to look at all the pools of allowances right now and see where we can appropriately remove them without having big swings in the sectors for minimizing leakage or ratepayer impacts. So that will be part of the ongoing discussion. The reason that you're seeing on the benchmarks that we're pushing out to 2031 is because we know long-term planning can be anywhere from 2 to 5 to 6 years. And so changing benchmarks that would kick in right away that speak to allocation and availability of capital or the way things may be planned for investments or upgrades, it could potentially disrupt that in the near term. And so we're trying to be a bit more thoughtful about where we can put some things in place sooner and where it makes more sense to push out things like benchmarks a bit ways out and allow for that planning exercise to remain undisturbed. Thanks.
Okay, and so does that also apply to the EDU administrative changes y'all were talking about, or are those on a separate timeline outside of just the general EDU allocation structure?
We're still thinking through that, and that would be part of a staff initial staff proposal.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more hand raised. And next we will hear from Frank Harris. Frank, you may unmute yourself and begin.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. My name is Frank Harris. I'm with the California Municipal Utilities Association. I really appreciate the presentation today and the opportunity to speak. I also want to thank staff for the time they've provided for meetings and discussions leading up to today's workshop, and I'm sure what we'll see in further meetings and discussions going forward. I want to speak directly to the role that cost plays with regard to California's clean energy goals and the clear link between that and the cost of compliance. While we talk about allocation to utilities and the utility sector, as some of my colleagues in the publicly owned utility space and the investor-owned utility space have mentioned, it's really an allocation on behalf of electricity customers in the state of California. And I think that's really an important key to keep in mind. I've heard statements about blunting the incentive to consume electricity, but at the same time, statements about preserving the incentive for fuel switching. And candidly, I'm not sure that those two goals walk together. As we look at the state's clean energy goals and its state's fuel switching goals, I think it's really paramount that we look to maintaining the affordability of electricity as great of a degree as possible. The energy affordability crisis that we're facing right now does not have one single source of responsibility, but I would respectfully suggest that moving forward, every single regulatory change that has an impact on energy prices be evaluated in the framework of maintaining affordability. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I'm sure we'll be submitting written comments.
Thank you, Frank. Very much appreciate the perspectives. And I think we're hearing loud and clear the concerns related to affordability, and we look forward to reviewing your comments when they're submitted.
Looks like we don't have any hands raised currently. So if Mark, would you like to wrap up today's public comment session? Okay, thank you everyone for joining our public comment session. Mark, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Cypress. So the slide here, just as we come to a close, I first want to say thank you very much for spending the morning with us and for the good feedback. We really look forward to seeing your comments that come in response to this. The slide here is just showing, some, over time, there's been some concerns raised recently about impacts of the program related to local air pollution. There's been some questions about the allowance supply within the program. There's been some kind of external evaluations of the forest offset credit program. The links here are going to be available to you on the slides. There are factual information that CARB staff has provided on these topics, in addition to the array of information that's available at the Cap and Trade program website. So that will all be available to you. And as we wrap up, I'll just remind, we do have here that feedback can be through June 14th. It will be okay if we will update these to provide one extra week, because I know there's some technical issues that were raised and it might take a little bit of time to gain understanding. So we will keep the comment docket open for a little while longer after that. We do have the link here to submit or to the meetings and workshops webpage. We will post the recording of this workshop. It will take us a few days in order to get the video prepared to publicly post, but it should be up by the end of next week. So that will be available for you to kind of review in case there were items that were missed or unclear the first time through. The slides are available at this link, and there will be the submit comments button there for you to submit the comments through, we're going to say June 21st right now. And with that, I will say, thanks again for spending time. It's really important process for us to have these conversations and to get feedback from, a wide diversity of viewpoints that are represented here. We had, hundreds of people here, and really appreciate those who were able to provide their feedback in real time, and very much look forward to receiving the written comments by the June 21 deadline. With that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much, and wish you a good weekend.